All right. Welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm here with Matt Segall. He was here earlier. We did a Benita Roy and Matt conversation. Of course, he was also on Transcendent Naturalism. I know folks in this area probably are familiar with him. He is the next Whitehead, or however we might want to
Ah,
frame his brilliant explorations into Whitehead, extending them in a wide variety of different ways. Matt, it's great to have you here.
really good to be back with you, Greg. I would need to know at least a little math to live up to that title
Okay.
of next Whitehead,
Right.
but
Well, I just,
I appreciate
I'm
it.
deeply impressed with the various extensions and insights that you're affording through the process philosophy and other angles you bring to bear. Um, we got talking a little bit because Matt had done a review of The Blind Spot, excellent new book, exploring how it's problematic if human experience is not included in the scientific equation, as it were. I did a review of that, and obviously, folks know that UTOK concerns itself directly with the relationship of scientific knowledge and subjective knowledge, in particular in the context of how we think about the world, say, through the tree of knowledge as a natural scientific ontology, and how we also position ourselves in the coin, our own subjective experience, and how we need to bridge those two. And Matt also has a lot of awesome insights, I think, to bring to bear, both on the book and his perspective. So that'll be kind of our loose topic. But I think he and I have lots of different things we can talk about, so we'll see where it goes. So that's the general setup. And so welcome to talk about the blind spot, process philosophy, and wherever else it takes us.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think this book speaks to both of us for obvious reasons. The work that you've been engaged in to bring together the humanities and the natural sciences in this more comprehensive, systematic perspective, and many of the dialogues you've been hosting on your channel with John and others um, are obviously right in the thick of the questions that Adam Frank, Marcelo Gleiser, and Evan Thompson are exploring in this book. And likewise for me, I think, gosh, it's been years, maybe even a decade. Let's say almost a decade since Evan Thompson mentioned to me that he was really digging into Whitehead's work. Um, and was planning to write something about them. I don't know that when I first heard from him that he was digging into Whitehead, that he had already conceived of this particular book. I think, from what I
Mm-hmm.
understand, there was a conference several years ago where Evan met his co-authors who were both physicists, and they hatched this idea, and it gave Evan a chance to share some of what he was uh, extracting from Whitehead's work. But it's predominantly, though it draws on Whitehead's early philosophy of science, um,
Mm-hmm.
well, somewhat early. He was already in his 60s, but Whitehead has his first 25 years at Cambridge doing math, working with
Mm-hmm.
Russell on the Principia and all these things. And then the second scientific revolution gets underway, right?
Yep.
Relativity theory and quantum theory come onto the scene, and that draws Whitehead into the philosophy of science. And
Right.
he begins to write. He writes these three books from 1919 to 1922: Principles of Natural Knowledge, The Concept of Nature, and The Principle of Relativity. And that's the concept of nature in particular that Thompson's drawing on in The Blind Spot. But for the most part, the book is a kind of transcendental, phenomenological critique of scientific reductionism,
Yep.
scientific materialism, in an attempt to put human experience for them really back at the center of everything.
Right.
Not in an anthropocentric way, but they're trying to walk this line. What do they call it? The strange loop, right?
Yep.
Where the human being and human experience is both at the center of everything science knows, and the universe that science knows makes it seem as though the human being is not actually the
Right.
center.
Exactly.
And so they don't fully resolve that tension, but they mark it in a way that I think is a helpful goalpost, let's say. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. It's a
So
beautiful
that's just my
description.
overall sense. And
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
So one of the things I'll just, for people know UTOK. So UTOK frames as one of the core problems is the enlightenment gap. The Enlightenment gaps, the inability to build a coherent, workable frame of matter and mind on the one hand, ontologically, and then objective scientific knowledge and subjective and socially constructive knowledge epistemologically. And at a very base root, you can argue that what science does through Galileo is build a mathematical model of primary qualities which are quantifiable. And then what we're doing there is we're taking out subjective, we're both dividing the world into objective material and subjective mind. And then we're trying to create procedures to factor out the subjective mind and build some sort of mathematical God's eye view of change or structure or whatever we decide, sort of the fundamental essentialist, reductive, physicalist versions of reality are. At least that's a brand of science that's done. And this is the brand, of course, that they're critiquing. And I think they do an admirable job of the critique. It is definitely a critique rather than a construction. They admit that as much. And I know you have some things to say about what sort of pointing maybe they could have done in a little bit more of a constructive way. But let's just talk a little bit about what you wrote up or offered in terms of, as you did an excellent blog on the book and offered some reflections. So maybe you could just share a little bit about kind of what you saw in the book, what you thought was. We'll start with what you saw there, and what you thought was valuable about it. I think you're muted there.
Thanks. Yeah, I couldn't stop thinking about the book and writing about the book. I was asked to write a review of it by a French magazine that's more, I think it's like a spiritual magazine, but wanting to be in dialogue with the sciences. And so they thought this book would be of interest to their audience. And they only wanted like 1,000 words or something, but I was like, I have more to say about this. So thankfully I have my own blog. But yeah, I think it is primarily a critical work. They're criticizing these. It's a related idea that they draw both from Husserl, his sense of surreptitious substitution, and also from Whitehead, his sense of the bifurcation of nature, which leads to what he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And you started to get at it there with Galileo's split. I mean, and others, John Locke had a similar split between primary and secondary characteristics. And what ends up happening as they articulate it is that uh, modern science starts to build these elaborate mathematical models of the physical world. And of course, all along the way, those models have certain touch points in the empirical world, in other words,
Mm-hmm.
in human experience. But as the techniques for and the instrumentation used to provide those empirical touch points became more and more complex, it became more and more about artificial laboratory conditions and
Yep.
further and further removed from everyday human experience of sight and sound and touch and all of these sense organs that put us in contact with the concrete reality of nature. Even to say nature in the modern world, we're immediately led to think of the physical models
Yep.
that science has developed. And so the surreptitious substitution happens when the very compelling physical models come to be thought of as what is primary. And we get in a situation where, oh, the universe really is uh, the quantum wave function, or really is the space-time manifold. And so out of that picture of how matter and energy works that we've developed with great mathematical precision, let's see how we can then get human consciousness out of that,
Totally.
forgetting that actually human consciousness was always there from the beginning. It's the precondition for us to even do any of that abstraction, for us to do any of that laboratory work. And so they want to rewind the clock, as it were, and understand what has happened in the modern scientific period, where we got so entranced by the knowledge that we were able to produce that we forgot where it came from, and we committed Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And so I think that critique is so important so that we can understand in a more adequate way what science is, how it works, how it's possible, while and honoring and respecting the knowledge that it can produce. while not um, getting ourselves in such a tangle that we end up with something like the hard problem of consciousness, that we end up with all of these dead ends where we're trying to squeeze uh, our own concrete existence as conscious agents out of a model which can't, in principle, provide that. The
Totally.
model presupposes our conscious agency, right? So, such an important critique that you know they managed to get across in, I think, a really clear way. And in my review, I express personal disappointment that they didn't go further into a kind of speculative cosmological mode to say, okay, this doesn't work. What might be a bigger picture that we can replace the scientific materialist view with that would be more coherent, give more of a place to human experience without inflating us too much. Um, and so but that's my wheelhouse, and that's not
Yeah.
what they were trying to do in this book. So it's not a criticism of their book. But as I said, it's a phenomenological orientation primarily, which means they're basically bracketing the question of ontology.
Yep.
And they're just saying, let's attend to human experience and let's not rush into the speculative mode until we've really grounded ourselves in our own embodiment. And all of that's well taken. Um, and I think there's this other project I think both of us are interested in, which
Right.
is what is the alternative cosmology? What's the alternative world picture to replace the one that they have so thoroughly demolished in
Right.
this text?
It's beautiful. So a couple things that I want to say. Really, just an enormous amount of synergy here. So John and I, in transcendent naturalism, we delineated sort of we divide that up into two parts. One is the extended naturalism, and then the other is transcendent, the opportunity for strong transcendence. But it's the extended naturalism that is essentially the term for the alternative view that we're taking. And now we're really in the process then of fleshing it out. John starts extended naturalism with exactly the statement that you make, essentially, is that science presupposes certain things like human knowledge that can be real. That somehow you need to have, so our claim is somehow we need an ontology that affords belief in human knowledge. That needs to be included. And part of that is human phenomenology. I would use the term justification systems, the propositional networks that allow us to make particular types of argumentative claims. But all of these things need to be in the furniture of the universe, as it were. Yet a reductive flat ontology, a reductive physicalist ontology, makes that very vulnerable, I think, to a performative contradiction in its very in the network of legitimizing. The only way you can really do it is if you split knowing from being and argue really there's a God's eye view, and they talk about this, and that we would have the capacity to discover the real true God equation for all unfolding behavior. That we can then point to and say this is the deterministic quantum, Schrodinger wave equation for all things, all the time, in a context independent way that exists in an algorithm. And then the universe runs off of that completely separate. So you have your epistemological God side view versus the ontology. And boy, that's just not where we are. And I think it's fundamentally misconstruing our relationship with knowledge. And I think the quantum revolution in particular, but also general relativity, places it very clear that to the extent we're going to build knowledge systems, the observer-observed relation is going to be placed in that. And I actually also believe the human relation needs to be placed in that, human phenomenology. And so their point about human experience in the knowledge that we create was deeply well taken from or deeply appreciated from the vantage point that John and I are bringing with extended naturalism. So I just wanted to sort of offer that parallel and how we kind of are framing it as we're trying to construct sort of an alternative naturalism to the physicalism that is so dominant.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some sense, we're trying to understand how human knowing is itself, it's not outside of the things that it's studying. It's not outside of nature. It's part and parcel of the natural processes that science has been engaged in studying. But as you're saying, because of this blind spot or this God's eye view, uh, the epistemology of science has not been too self-reflective about its own epistemological preconditions, right? And has been busying itself building uh, self-correcting models
Yep.
of the natural world. But that process of model making has gone so far that now the human being is increasingly being encroached upon by the modeling apparatuses, and that's where we're hitting these dead ends because as Whitehead would say in the concept of nature, um, when we're studying the natural world, Whitehead would say we're studying what we are aware of in perception. And this is his attempt to refound modern science on a more coherent basis instead of separating primary and secondary characteristics, instead of saying all the measurable stuff that we can quantify is really out there in nature and everything else is a subjective dream. Whitehead says, no, everything we perceive is in nature. The red hue of the sunset, as much as the electromagnetic waves that physicists might want to study. But the key here in unbifurcating our picture of nature so that primary and secondary characteristics are, maybe a helpful heuristic in some cases, but we do not want to ontologize that.
Definitely.
What we're doing is we're studying the systematic relationships among uh, various perceptions. And so what is a scientific theory, or let's say a hypothesis rather, become in that context? It's a stand-in. It's where we're hypothetically imagining that there's something beyond what we can currently perceive
Mhm.
that might be causing what we perceive.
Yep.
But the shift here is, instead of being satisfied uh, with a hypothesis of some underlying substrate or process or activity that would be unperceivable in principle, we want we want to shift science to trying to imagine hypotheses that could in principle become perceivable, like whatever that underlying process is. And that doesn't mean with our eyes or our
Mhm.
ears, but maybe
Mhm.
with instrumentation. And you can see how in physics and often in cognitive science as well, there are a lot of models that are operate that can be operationalized and instrumentalized and make predictions that sometimes line up, sometimes not so much. Uh, but the the mechanisms being hypothesized are also being hypostatized, meaning they're being treated as something independent not only of what we can perceive now, but in principle unperceivable. So in physics, this
Mhm.
would be something like string theory.
Yep.
Can't even test it. But the math works,
Right.
you know, and you can have a model in like cognitive neuroscience, like the free energy principle. Very compelling model. It seems to apply not only to brains, but to anything,
Mm.
any individuated system. But is that model how the brain is actually doing what it's
Mhm.
doing?
Mhm.
Um, I don't think that's been shown. And so it might be that something like the free energy principle in cognitive neuroscience, or something like string theory in physics, it's the kind of hypothesis that's postulating something in principle unperceivable.
Mhm.
And this more Whiteheadian approach to science, and the way that these authors seem to be suggesting we move forward, is to think of a hypothesis as like a scaffolding that we would eventually want to tear down. We're not going to
Mm.
be satisfied with positing a hidden mechanism
Mhm.
that would be always a conjecture that's beyond our capacity to ever perceive or even measure with an instrument empirically in
Mhm.
some case, in some
Mhm.
way. To thinking, yeah, that we do hypothesize and build models in science, but um, we're always trying to move from the model to something perceivable. And this is very much in line with what I describe in my article as the Goethean method of science,
Yes, I would
right?
like to get into that. Yeah, I
Where
found that fascinating.
the facts themselves rightly ordered become the
Mhm.
theory,
Yep.
right? Rather than the theory being of something beyond the
Yes.
phenomena, behind the phenomena.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, that run very near and dear to my heart in terms of the um, so what the actually UTOK gets founded. I don't know if you and I have ever discussed this, but so UTOK gets founded on a thing called the justification hypothesis. And what this is it's an idea, and I'll be clear as to why this is a deep connection in my own experience to what you've laid out here. So the justification hypothesis, I got into evolutionary psychology and was tracking certain things, but there's a big contrast in evolutionary psychology between sort of the human nature and the essential modules of the mind, as it were, that would evolve, and the social construction of reality, say from a feminist perspective or a Wittgensteinian language game or continental philosophy perspective, etc. And then I backed into an insight that bridges that gap. And that insight is the idea that once we move from symbolic tagging, so let's say we're hunter-gatherers together, we're able to synchronize our minds in particular kinds of ways. Michael Tomasello talks about our capacity to do this. And you can imagine a symbolic tagging structure, antelope there, and that coordination, and we can see in some of the behavior patterns of our ancestors and in the archaeological record, I think we see good coordinated stuff. But there's also an argument that there's a tipping point here where we get into propositional, symbolic, syntactical, semantic information in the form of propositions. There are the antelope. And why exactly that evolves out of Chomsky and universal language device, whatever you get at. But from a dynamic, interactive perspective, as soon as you have propositions, you got positive meaning statements to be claimed. And the argument then is that these become potential operators on the world that can then be challenged with questions. So their antelope requires sort of a behavioral enactment of a challenge. We'll look over there, we'll do various things, right? But a proposition that says there are the antelope then affords the opportunity to be challenged, like how do you know, or why, or what are those antelope? Are they gazelle? Also, there becomes potentially channeled with values. Well, there are rabbits. Maybe we should go hunt those. So the bottom line is propositions set the stage for question-answer dynamics. Okay. And then question-answer dynamics then create a problem of justification. Then we need networks of legitimizing or coordinating our investment in influence. And then the argument fundamentally is basically the ego. The self-conscious I, me narrator is nature's solution to this. It's a mental organ of justification. Okay? It affords then a talking on your primate self. So we have a primate self with other primates, and now you got an ego that's talking about it. And now it's talking about it with others in an intersubjective propositional context that builds systems then of justification. Okay? These are the coordinating networks of beliefs and values that legitimize action and regulate behavior and form identity, etc. Exactly what the social constructionists are pointing to that says, hey, you grow up in a particular society, etc. Okay? Why is this relevant to me at the level of speaking to the kind of science? Well, what happened to me was I actually formulated the justification hypothesis as a hypothesis. Okay, I was like, oh, and it makes certain predictions about the way in which our egos will be biased and certain kinds of outcomes will legitimize. And I started looking, it's like actually cognitive dissonance and self-serving biases and Freud, all that stuff actually is really networked exactly into what this predicts. And I built a couple of early experimental designs. But you know what I realized as I was doing that was I was trying to justify the justification hypothesis. Okay. And this then became a self-recursive loop upon me, right? It was like, oh my gosh, the phenomenology of being in the world is now manifest in a description that's actually, I was an explanation, but then it becomes a way I describe. In fact, I think of us as persons, justifying persons, and primates, embodied primates, as both. And it's the connection to the phenomenology, which was absolutely central, and the connection to the real world of being. And one of the things I say about UTOK is a lot of science, fundamentally, physicists, neuroscience, even the behaviorists and the Freudians, actually really are pulling us away from our everyday phenomenology. They're like, oh, it looks like it's this, but that's just an appearance and illusion. What's really going on is unconscious drives and schedules of reinforcement or quarks that are vibrating, right? And I'm not saying that's not true, but man, we need, and that's why I very much appreciate it. It's also the case that to the extent that we are being pulled further and further away from our embodied phenomenology, the empiricism of science is going to lose its fundamental, what do we mean first person, third person empiricism? What are we looking at? Science is grounded first in first person, then it switches over to third person empiricism. I would argue we need both. We need a descriptive metaphysical system for first and third person empiricism. Um, and so that's how I heard, that's how I'm coming into the book, both hear its critique and then hearing your comments about, uh, what kind of science should we be oriented toward? What is it will deliver? And to me, the extent that it's going to deliver an enriching understanding of describing our being as is, as opposed to abstracting away from it. I'm open to either, but to the extent that it abstracts and eliminates, come on. So anyway, that's a long-winded narrative, but you're muted there. So
Thanks. Sorry.
mhm.
No, I appreciate that connection to UTOK very much. And I'm quite interested as well in how human beings have evolved to become proposition wielding beings who care about truth and falsehood, and who have this whole semantic network of propositions that when we're our best rational selves, we're trying to make more consistent and coherent. Um, and in some sense, Whitehead's whole metaphysics is an attempt to, I mean, he has his categorical scheme, right? And he wants it to be internally consistent and coherent. But crucially, he also wants it to be applicable and adequate to our experience. So he has his rational criteria, which is the consistency and the coherence, and the empirical criteria, which are, does this apply to what I feel, what I taste, what I see, what I hear? And is it applicable across all the domains of my experience, not just in science, but do these metaphysical categories also seem to help me make sense of my aesthetic experience and art and literature and uh, religious and spiritual experience, relationships, everything, the full swath of human experience. And so, being able to be clear about what happens when we become proposition wielding creatures, I think uh, the, the danger there is that we do get lost in the models. Uh, and so, yeah, we're trying to recover this embodied phenomenology, which, they refer to both in that sense, but also as direct experience. But you were talking about science on the empirical level, switching from the first to the third person. I also really appreciated the way they dwelled on the second person dimension. And they actually, I was just rereading this morning in the consciousness chapter, page 219, for those who have the book. They talk about experience being inherently intersubjective and shareable, and that science would not be possible if this were not the case. And in the context of the hard problem, uh, getting beyond the hard problem of consciousness, they say means asking how what we understand to be physical objects arise out of experience instead of asking how experience arises out of physical objects. Um, but then they go on to say that's just the first step, is to get clear that these models we have of the physical world or even models of the brain come
Yep.
out of our experience. We can't say experience comes out of a model of the brain. It just won't work that way. But then they go on to say that the second step would be turning the hard problem sideways, which means realizing that I and you experience already permeates I experience. So in other words, the second person already permeates the first person. Your
Yep.
ability to reflect on your own experience comes from your having internalized outside perspectives on yourself as you mentally develop in infancy and childhood. In the language of cognitive science, this kind of metacognition or reflection on your own experience is a special case of social cognition, right? Before we even become proposition wielding creatures, speaking animals, there's already a kind of shared group mind thing going at the species level.
Yep.
And language seems to be, I don't know, a second order, maybe, I don't know what order, it's another
Third
order,
order, I think, but go
third
ahead.
order.
Yeah.
There, yeah, thank you for the UTOK terminology there.
um,
Um, where all of a sudden we become immersed in symbolic uh, that holds us accountable to some new form of order.
yep.
Um, than just our physical senses, right? And
Yep.
we begin to construct whole worlds, a matrix really out of this symbolic
Absolutely.
uh, language that we have. But Yeah, I mean, and so I'm not, but we're always still in this intersubject. We have this intersubjective ground that they really want to say comes before any sense of separate ego, or any sense of separate object. That there's this shared milieu of experience. Um, and so, yeah, we could explore that. But I also want to, I mean, just in terms of the evolution of language, um, there are different approaches to how this originates, and I mean, Noam Chomsky is a hero of mine.
Mhm.
But having studied cognitive science as an undergrad, his understanding of language and its origins never quite sat well with me
Yep.
because it's kind of a new, and he admits this himself in the title of his book. It's a new kind of Cartesianism in the sense that there's a real human difference here.
Totally.
And you could say there's a mutation, a new gene that made the brain capable of this universal grammar thing. And so it's consistent with evolution, but it's a sharp break between what humans can do and so
Yep.
Chomsky would always dismiss, no, those apes aren't actually using sign language. No, those parrots aren't actually speaking to you. And I'm not so sure about such a sharp line here, right?
Yep.
And I'm kind of, because I'm in the Goethean, I'm very interested in Goethe's approach to science and
Mm.
that the sort of lineage that goes through people like Rudolf Steiner and then Owen Barfield.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a whole theory of language here where instead of thinking language originates in like simple words for things like antelope there,
Mhm.
and there's a real sense of
Mhm.
having to, language originally in oral cultures would have to be very rooted in the moment. You can't
Yeah.
refer to situations in the past or the future very easily, if at all. But what Barfield would suggest, instead of that piecemeal sense that, oh, we language starts with these individual words designating things in the world, there would be more of this global sense of meaning that actually has to be internally differentiated more and more.
Mhm.
And so, usually anthropologists would say language starts in that very literalistic sense.
Mm.
Here's a sound that means that thing right there. And then later on, as we get more sophisticated, we get things like metaphors and
Mhm.
poetry and all of this stuff.
Mhm.
Barfield says, no, 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 that's backwards.
Mhm.
Language starts as poetic and
Mm.
metaphorical, and being literal is actually a later achievement
Mm.
and a result of a further internal differentiation of our sense of meaning.
Mhm.
And so, I don't know. It's not to say that I disagree with the story you were telling. It's just to say that I wonder sometimes if at this point in the evolution of consciousness, when we we have a mastery of propositional logic, we think in a we can think in very literalistic ways about language, that we have we're projecting a little bit our very developed sense of what language is
Mhm.
and just simplifying it in almost like an atomistic reductionistic way to understand how it may have started, when it could be that it started more holistic and then became more atomized as it evolved. So I don't know what you think about that, but I
Yeah,
wanted to
no,
throw
I've
that into the mix too.
certainly, yeah, no, it's, I am mostly agnostic in relationship to the evolution of language. The Chomskyan version, I'd be drawn more to, and from an evolutionary perspective, I'd be drawn more to a pinker language instinct that there may be important tipping points, either genetically or, but the idea that it's a hopeful monster, at least that's the critique against Chomsky, that all of a sudden this unbelievable machinery just appears full force in the world, seems unlikely to me. I've seen charades versions. There's a recent book called The Language Game that
Hmm.
talks about basically thinking about language in terms of evolution of charades, like how do we coordinate our behavior and how do we playfully construct. That was certainly very consistent. Merlin Donald's got some good articulations about various sequences. Um, my basic point is this with it. I really want to be minimalist because I was an evolutionary psychologist for 2 years or so, and then I sort of evolved, out of, critiqued it, etc. There's a lot of dangerous circular essentialist thinking, I think, in evolutionary psychology that over reifies the fun hypotheses without realizing how difficult it is, almost like string theory, to go back and empirically test what this
Mhm.
might be. The nice thing about all this says is propositions create a tipping point. That's basically what it says. And there's propositions and question answer dynamics would create a tipping
Right.
point.
Yep.
And then actually this tipping point creates a new adaptive problem called the problem of justification.
Yep.
And the problem of justification then, and as a clinician, especially looking for big picture views that organize psychology, it immediately then gives rise to, oh, I have an internal justifier where I'm trying to justify myself. Okay, and then I have a public persona I'm trying to justify to others, and I got filtration dynamics between them. And then when you look at, well, what are you trying to do? Well, I'm trying to justify to others relative to investment and influence. I got to justify myself in terms of coherence, sense making, consistency, narrative, right? And then I look at cognitive dissonance, social psychology, Freudian theory, etc. And you get a very, very nice tight mapping between what must have been an evolutionary time. At some level, propositions are coming along. Propositions do create a question answer dynamic. And then all
Mhm.
we need is from there to look at the current state of consciousness at both the social psychology up into cultural level and the egoic psychology as it narrates the primate in relationship to lived experience.
Yeah.
And you get a very nice, tight advance on a number of different dynamics, still being very open to all sorts of different possibilities, which
Yeah.
I want to know what I don't know and not overcommit. I thought Chomsky overcommitted myself
Mm.
in certain kinds of
Yeah.
elements.
I mean, it does seem though that there was uh a I'll say bifurcation moment in the evolution of human language where you see this in figures like Socrates, where this question answer dynamic emerges
Totally.
out of what had been, up to that point, basically an oral culture that was immersed in the Homeric myths and these what is questions, like asking, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah,
It's a breakthrough into a totally new kind of consciousness that needs rational justification for the things that it says,
totally.
whereas that was never needed before. It's like, well, what
Yep.
do you mean? I just told you. I'll just. Do you want me to repeat what Homer said? I mean,
That's
so
right.
there's a shift out of narrative into a more propositional form of reason, and that is it's a pretty sharp break. I mean, it's the basis
Mm-hmm.
of like the axial
Totally.
moment,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
absolutely.
you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah. I
so
mean, I
we
think
do
you
need
can
it.
track evolutions of justification. I see science as a particular kind of evolution in the system of justification. An
Right.
increasingly attempt to eliminate the subject and context, social, moral context, and do it. What can we do to be mind independent? When we measure
Yeah.
shit and develop logical, deductive, analytic elements to try to eliminate other explanations and leave a pristine, logical structure that maps what is measured. I mean, and then that exists at a God's eye view as opposed to us humans knowing about stuff. So that's an evolution in the system of human justification. I would say the blind spot is like, well, yeah, but ultimately all of that is in the project. All of that's underlying the process of human phenomenology and justification is actually given rise to all of
Right.
that.
Right.
And the idea that you
Right.
have successfully eliminated that to yield pristine universal knowledge is a fantasy. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
set of the four errors that they say that they delineate us having made to come to that
Right.
abstracted
Yeah.
conclusion in a problematic way.
uh, Eric Vogelin has this great term, mythospeculation,
Mm.
where he looks to this transitional figure like Plato, right, who's telling us all about Socrates and this mutation moment
Yeah,
that led to his fellow citizens, you know, condemning him to death for it. Like, really disturbing to the society where this occurred. People
totally.
would start asking questions and needing justification. But um, Vogelin looks at Plato's work as this transitional moment where you have this need for justification and this birth of a new kind of rationality embedded in narrative. I mean, he's writing dialogues, but also every dialogue after it goes through logically trying to sort out these different problems, it always ends basically in aporia, in, well, we've explored all the positions and none of them are quite satisfying, but here's a myth that might help you feel the way forward in a non-rational way.
Yep.
And so mythospeculation is this moment that Vogelin wants to point to as a healthy integration or synthesis between story and uh, science, or
Lovely.
myth and reason, right? And what happened in the modern period is that we thought well, we don't need the story, we don't need the narrative. Let's just do the rationality part. And that has led us into an extreme existential disorientation,
Completely.
meaninglessness, nihilism, right? You always, because you ask you ask all these questions of justification, and you end up losing, you forget your story, you forget how you even got to where you are, and what is this even for? And so keeping the mythic and the rational in a healthier, uh, mutually informing dialogue, I think is really important. Because there's some things that reason can do that myth is horrible at, but there's a lot of things that reason cannot do that we as human beings absolutely need to live healthy, fulfilling lives. So bringing
Totally.
those two back together is so important.
Yeah, no, that's a deep principle of UTOK. So
Mhm.
UTOK's got its three philosophical pillars, and it mops this off of the Greek rhetoric position. So
Mm.
the iQuad coin represents the subjective, phenomenological, unique, individual, particular, and that's going to your pathic sense of being in the real world that is embedded in your affective phenomenology, your feelings, and then from that perspective, you then narrate what you are and what you care about and who you are as Matt and as I do it as Gregg. And that's the ideographic, unique, particular, historically contingent subject. Okay.
Mm.
Which I argue is actually exactly antithetical to what science is trying to explain. Right? It's like
Right.
an embedded phenomenological subjective experience where all of your uniqueness is from science
Yeah.
perspective is error. It's like that's just
Or it just
that's
doesn't
a
even show up. It's not even
doesn't show
visible to
up,
it.
right? It's just to whatever extent is your differentiation important from a scientific perspective, your differentiation is either inexplicable, blind, or error. It's just not relevant. So you have this complete language game differentiation of figure ground there. And the tree of knowledge, the upside down cones that says, hey, it starts as an energy information into matter object, living organism, minded animal, and cultured person. That gives it a natural ontology of complexification. And the argument is that yes, we can stand outside and create. It's not a God's eye view, but a human construction, reconstruction of complexification of behavioral patterns across a stack and processes that enable us to see that expansion in a way that would yield would be justifiably defended as objective. But it's an intersubjective justification for objective knowledge. So you have to contextualize that. And I was very glad that the book did that. And then the tree of knowledge then sits inside the garden. So in UTOK, so the overall picture of UTOK is the garden. It's the first branch on the tree of life, and then the tree of life sits in relation. And underneath the garden then sits underneath the elephant sun god, the concept of God. And so the garden then represents mythos, which is basically the story we tell ourselves, right? And about how we're going to actually live it. Because the embodied process of justification is not just legitimizing what is, but it's also legitimizing what ought to be. We sit on the cusp of past, present, future, and we care. And to the extent that we sit on the cusp of past, present, future, and care, then what ought to be is every bit as real as what was, depending on the valuation framing that we're going to make salient or relevant. So anyway, the garden then is essentially a scientific, humanistic, basically collective ought narrative. It's like, what is the story
Mm.
we ought to tell ourselves? That's what it symbolizes, and what would afford a story essentially back to paradise in a protopian sort of way. In other words, an adaptive way, not a genuinely mythical. Oh, yes, humans can live in paradise, but actually, given where we are, what's the adaptive moves? And what kind of story facilitates wise living or adaptive living or orienting toward cultivating valued states of being? And we need both. So we need the pathic individual subject. We need the more objective, intersubjectively objective version of kind of what is, and science affords us this. We need a collective narrative of meaning making and ultimately
Mm.
oriented toward. So that gives you your pathos, your logos, your mythos, and ethos would be sort of like, okay, how do we make decisions toward the good? And the concept of God for me represents or at least the trans. I've got a couple of gods, but one one god
Mm.
represents the transcendent and
Mm.
orienting in that regard.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Um, yeah, it's all in there. It's all in there, Greg. I think you've 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 done a great job capturing all the facets of this. Can I ask you a question about
Sure.
how you take a particular statement just, as a psychologist, and, you've spent a lot of time with evolutionary psychology and neuroscience, and at the end of their chapter on consciousness, they basically say, they talk about neurophenomenology, which is an
Hmm.
attempt to bring, these perspectives you're talking about into uh, more intimate um, coordination,
Yep.
but without privileging. Well, they do privilege. They privilege the phenomenology
Hmm.
over the what can be measured in the brain, but
Right.
they take what can be measured in the brain very seriously. But they basically say, well, I'll quote them. Um, the problem for neuroscience, if we eliminate the blind spot, can no longer be stated as how the brain generates consciousness. Instead, the problem is how the brain, as a perceptual object within consciousness, relates to the brain as part of the embodied conditions for consciousness, right? And so it's a pretty uh, major, uh, you know, turn in if neuroscience were to take this course
Hmm.
of action, so that it would no longer be a neuroscientific or thought of as a neuroscientific problem.
Yep.
How does the brain produce consciousness?
Yep.
That wouldn't even be a sensible question to ask.
Yep.
And instead, it becomes, no, how do we relate what we experience and find uh, invariant patterns between what we experience, like in terms of, like, Varela already did some experiments with time consciousness, and find the patterns in whether it's brain waves or fMRI scanners or whatever, to see it's a little bit subtler than the idea of neural correlates of consciousness, because again, we're not saying that the consciousness is in the brain and
Right.
here's the correlate. We found it. It's this thing right
Yeah.
here, vibrating in this way or whatever. But it's a subtler form of invariance and the patterns that we're looking for. But do you think that they're right in trying to almost re-inaugurate neuroscience, shifting its focus and its problems in a different direction like this?
So that's a great question. I deeply appreciate it. My life now is being organized around this problem of consciousness. So ever since the Consilience conference, I sort of then backed into, like, I was reading a few things and I was like, listen, this hard problem thing, I think we framed this hard problem thing all wrong.
Mhm.
And so and I think that John and I built a system that is that can change the game a bit in the way things have been done. And I think the work you're doing is in the ballpark of what we're doing in this regard. And I think we're then on the cusp. And with the blind spot, you see this. There's a book, Putting Ourselves Back in the Equation. I have it up here by George Musser. Basically, it's another essential book, basically saying, hey, we have this idea, we got to put the observer, it's the observer-observed relations that somehow we need a framework for. And that's when we have this holistically, a lot of things change. So to go to your question, basically, I'll outline the way I'm in the midst of writing a book on this, and I'll give you a little bit. So as I hear that, my short answer is yes, generally, but it's also pretty abstract, and I want to be more concrete about what are the problems, how are we thinking about them, what's being proposed. So that's my kind of answer to
Mhm.
that. But I'm very sympathetic to it. So
Mm.
I'll share with you a little bit about what John and I are doing in tackling this. And basically, we're dividing the hard problem into two problems. Okay. The hard problem is there are problems, interesting problems. If we stay with just a common sense view, somehow you wake up in the morning and you have a magic camera in your head that allows the world to come online. And when you fall asleep or you hit your head, that all goes away potentially. And there is a way in which there are what we call sort of the neurobiological engineering problem, is a problem to be that we believe we've made significant progress on. I'm diving into a lot of neuroscience research now, and I would say in the last year, just my own edification, my phenomenology is shaped increasingly just in terms of its body experience of, oh, my brainstem embodied in my somaticizing structure is pulling homeostatic feeling structures and downloading them into my thalamus, which is now, secretarially sending signals. They're organizing them in my what's called the posterior hotspot, jolting them into my frontal lobe, allowing me have access consciousness and play various options in a planning inhibition sort of way. That was present to me in the past, but now as I get increasingly rich of the neurocognitive, I actually prefer neurocognitive correlates. That's a technical thing, but the neurocorrelates of consciousness, the NCCs, afford, and there's also some mysteries and good questions to ask. However, if you read all the stuff on consciousness, you quickly realize we have a serious philosophical problem. And it's a philosophical problem here. There's a metaphysical, ontological, epistemological problem. We don't know how to grip the thing. Our conception of the brain exists in our minds. Clearly, the brain is sitting as a concept in our minds. The only way we're talking about it is how it represents. So inside, is the brain inside the mind or the mind inside the brain? Well, clearly both and depending on how you frame it. The idea that you can simply reduce mind to brain is ridiculous. Just ridiculous in my estimation. It's just a completely you don't know what you're talking about at the level of epistemology. You don't know what you're talking about at the level of knowledge. You don't know what you're talking about really at the level of the correct ontological mapping of the world. So what John and I are doing basically, so we're proposing this thing, extended naturalism. And what it says is this: we have a flawed conception of the natural world. Physicalism, basically, is the dominant. That's flawed. So this is essentially a Whiteheadian project. We need a much richer ontology of nature. Okay? And the emergence versus reduction debate sucks, I think. I think it's terribly confusing. I'm not a reductionist. I'm not a weak emergentist. I'm not a strong emergentist. There is a way to map the ontological, what we call layers and levels in nature. And that gives a much richer, ontologically rich picture of what the quote unquote, what is referred to as the physical world, which really should just be the natural world. Physical's too suggestive of reductive, and it's stuck in this bipolar matter, objective, subjective mind. Naturalism doesn't carry that problem. It's not the opposite of mind, or it doesn't even bring necessarily objective, subjective into strong opposition. And it's the proper word, because the best way to conceptualize what science really teaches us, at least within science, now we can talk theologically, but within natural science methodology, gives us access to the one natural world, basically. And then within that, how do we understand that? We need a rich, extended natural world ontology, and we need to pair that with a rich, extended understanding of human consciousness. Okay? And both of those things need to go together. Whereby what's happened in the field of now, I made this point, so the Closer to Truth guy, Robert Kuhn, had over the last, maybe you saw this, produced a landscape of consciousness article that I've now read almost all of, 140 pages thing. It's rich and dense. But it shows materialism's the dominant view, but it also shows there's a panoply of other views. But in paragraph 2, it also says, hey, we're not really concerned about how consciousness works. We're concerned with the classic mind-body problem, which is the philosophical nature problem. Like, what is it and how does it fit in the furniture of the universe? And that's why you get physicists, philosophers, and neuroscientists more than psychologists. There are a few psychologists, certainly, but those guys are, I think, if I'd be interested to count them, I haven't done that yet, but they're certainly dominant. But psychology then got split off with empirical questions about cognition, behavior, consciousness in the lab, but isn't in any place based on its own crisis to answer big picture questions relative to philosophy. So we have this complete bifurcation. John and I, as meta theorists in cognitive science and psychology, want to put the nature of philosophy question in very close contact with the psychological functional question to understand what it is and connect it. So we want to take a rich ontology, we want to take a rich picture of human consciousness, and we want to take a rich extended view of epistemology, not this objective subjective split, but really intersubjective, objective, subjective, and then transjective, meaning that all of these positions, the second person position, first person, the third person, a little similar to Wilber's quadrants, but more dynamic and interrelated, and through the lens of our work, but embracing that holistic epistemology, an extended naturalistic ontology, and an extended picture of human consciousness. And we think when you put that stuff together, what they are saying in the blind spot is going to be, oh, this is how the mind exists inside the brain, and the brain exists in the mind, qualified in a particular, what a particular meaning of mind can be asked. How does it relate to the brain? How does the brain generate the mind? There's a narrow way in which that question makes sense, and there's a broad way in which that question is senseless. We haven't figured out the right way to differentiate and clarify. That's what John and I are trying to do with our project. I see that's what you do with your project, and I have a better appreciation through that of what Whitehead was trying to do, because I'm no Whitehead scholar, and so that's why I'm starting to learn from you what all he was doing. Because my reading comprehension is not great, and Whitehead's sometimes a little hard to read. I'll throw that back over to you and see what you want to pick up on there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that answer, and I think it's clear that the mind-body problem and the place of consciousness in nature will remain a rich area for philosophical inquiry. But when it comes to neuroscience, I think there's been this unacknowledged metaphysical residue in the current research project that would be looking for a cranial explanation
Yeah.
of consciousness. We can certainly learn and have learned a lot about the physiological functions of the nervous system. Um, but that's different. I mean, phenomenal consciousness seems to be something else. The brain could function very well without anyone needing to be home to know that it's
Yeah.
functioning. And so that's the philosophical question. And I think it's not that we shouldn't be asking those questions. I mean, I certainly want to, you want to, but for neuroscience, it seems like this neurophenomenological approach looking for, I said, patterns that uh, are resonant across the seeming gap between experience and what can be measured in the brain. I think Varela actually used the phrase mutual constraints between
Mhm.
experience, which I should say also he thought, uh, and Evan Thompson argues that, we can cultivate and train our attention using phenomenology, but also different meditative techniques. And so, like the naive subject, the undergraduate you pull into the psych lab, might not necessarily be able to do this neurophenomenology thing
Mhm.
to really attend to the structure of uh, the temporal unfolding of a moment. You need to be trained to do that, just like you need to be trained to look through a microscope and know what
Totally.
you're looking at. And so it's taking experience seriously as something that's not just arbitrary, subjective, whatever, mere introspection, but that we can actually hone our capacity to observe and develop intersubjective language so we can engage in some degree of peer review about that. And phenomenologists have been doing this for a long time. Buddhists have been doing this for even longer. Um, and so it seems like a different, more empirical path forward for neuroscience. And
Okay.
it still leaves philosophers plenty to play with in terms of the deeper ontological questions here. But that's something they don't do in the book. Is okay, yes, neuroscience they're really just trying to clear up some problems
Right.
and redirect, I think, research in all the special sciences from physics to biology
Right.
to neuroscience. But they're not trying to give us that new cosmological context within which we would develop a worldview. Um, Maybe the next book, Evan says he's working on another book that might touch on that. Um,
Well,
so that leaves
that's a
us with
great
plenty of work to do.
segue. Yeah, I would like to. I want to make sure we get an opportunity to talk about kind of what, um, if you were a fourth author, are you going to write a sequel, or are you going to write your version about how that would look? You offered some thoughts about that in your blog that I thought were excellent. So let's talk about kind of how you see it, how you build off of Whitehead, or where your original contributions are, or what what second book do you wish could be written here to give a more constructive, forward-looking analysis about how we'd fill in this blind spot?
Well, philosophically speaking or ontologically speaking, I see that there are basically four major options.
Okay.
Um, there's materialism, there's dualism, there's idealism, and there's panpsychism. Um, Materialism is what they're mostly critiquing here, and there are ways in which uh, the sort of Cartesian like Descartes' way of looking at things. He's a dualist, obviously, but there's a way in which contemporary physicalism or materialism is a covert Cartesianism, in that
Definitely.
it
Hmm.
accepts the material substance, and Descartes' way of thinking about extended matter. It just doesn't want to mess with his mental substance and says we
Yeah.
don't need that. Um, and so, materialism and dualism, I think we can we can kind of push to the side. Uh, the two main contenders now, and they're increasingly popular um, on our little corner of the internet, but I
Yeah.
think also in academia, there's more and more attention being played to these things: idealism and panpsychism, right? And sometimes people group them, and the boundary between the two seems somewhat slippery. And often,
Hmm.
I'll hear Philip Goff defending panpsychism in a way that sounds like idealism to me.
Hmm.
That physical properties are properties of consciousness instead of the other way around. I'm like, oh, that sounds like idealism to me.
Hmm.
And similarly, when I read uh, what the authors of the blind spots say, that the problem for neuroscience is how the brain as a perceptual object within consciousness
Yeah.
relates to the brain as part of the embodied conditions for consciousness. It seems like they're leaning more in the direction of the brain is in consciousness.
Yeah.
Consciousness is the foundation. The brain appears in
That's what that sentence
that.
sounds like to me. Although
And
rest of the book,
transcendental
I'm not sure.
phenomenology
But
is coming out of idealism, right?
okay.
German idealism, you know.
Hmm.
And so they also treat panpsychism in this book, but they're specifically looking at Galen Strawson and Philip Goff,
Hmm.
and this idea that the argument for panpsychism in that context assumes a substance ontology, which is different from Whitehead's process relational ontology. And so the intrinsic nature argument is that, physics tells us the relational properties of the world,
Yeah.
consciousness is the intrinsic property. And I think, they really dismantle that idea, because they think of consciousness as inherently relational. This is part of that intersubjective ground I was talking about
Hmm.
earlier. Um, but they don't mention Whitehead's alternative form of panpsychism. Whitehead never uses the term panpsychism. Charles Hartshorne would later, one of Whitehead's inheritors, but uh, David Ray Griffin has proposed panexperientialism. But I think of Whitehead as a species of panpsychist, but by putting this idea that experience goes all the way down onto a process relational basis, a process relational ontology, that what there finally are occasions or events,
Right.
not intrinsic properties or bits of matter, certainly.
Hmm.
That changes a lot. And so Whitehead's panpsychism ends up being just as different from this analytic form of substance panpsychism as it is from materialism.
Right.
Um, and so, if I were to do a part two to this book that reconstructed,
Yeah,
uh,
can I double click on this a little bit? I'd really like
yeah,
to see if you can edify me in really in a deepening understanding of this So is it true then that Whitehead didn't call it pan experientialism?
he never uses that
He never
phrase
used
now.
that term. Okay, interesting. So there it is. I'm already getting edified. So that's good. Yeah. So can we get into these occasions and events and how these occasions and events then do set the stage ultimately, right? These are going to be the concepts and categories that he's going to use. It's going to end. He's not starting with the bifurcation of objective matter, subjective mind. He's placing it in a process relational. Could you zoom down a little bit for people like me and others that are listening and be like, okay, how do occasions, events, what then gets labeled pan experientialism. How does this get composited, or how does this grow, or what is this relation to when I wake up and have experiences myself?
Mm.
Is there a way we can elaborate that a little bit and get a more rich feel for what he's saying there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Whitehead is doing a kind of phenomenology and trying to distill the structure of experience and the dynamic of experience so that he can give a general description of it that would be general or generic enough to apply beyond just our human, very
Hmm.
elaborate, complex, intense human form of it.
Right.
But, and so if we were to take a moment in the life history of a human being, my own life history, Uh, what is the structure of that? Well, there's an inheritance of a past, and this is where Whitehead and Husserl are very similar. Husserl would talk about retention,
Mm-hmm.
inheritance of the past, memory, and in Husserl's terms, protension, or in Whitehead's terms, anticipation of the future.
Yep.
And so every moment is this, and Whitehead borrows William James's terms, specious present, so that there is no such thing as nature at an instant.
Mm-hmm.
Modern physics has often thought in terms of point instants. A point instant is a geometrical abstraction. It doesn't exist in nature. You
Mm-hmm.
cannot measure something with absolute precision so as to demarcate a point. It doesn't exist, just like a circle
Yep.
doesn't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very easy to forget that. So Whitehead's trying to go back to experience and say, what would be a more concrete ontology than this idea that modern physics came up with, that the world is made of space-time coordinates or something,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, or forces that radiate from point instance.
Mm-hmm.
Very great for model building. And in a sense, Whitehead's trying to recover the the baby that was thrown out with the Galilean bathwater,
Mm-hmm.
which is this old Aristotelian view of physics, which was wrong, just wrong about a lot of things, um, but that also was at least not bifurcated. There was still a sense that human subjectivity is a part of nature,
Mm-hmm.
purpose is a part of nature, and we needed that Galilean bifurcation and the birth of modern science to sort of, um, we needed a bucket of cold water poured on our heads to
Mm-hmm.
be less anthropocentric.
Yep.
But now we're in the position where we need to bring the human back in. And so Whitehead's looking at human experience and saying, what can I generalize here
Mm-hmm.
to develop an ontological account of experience as such, not a human experience, but just experience as such. And so the actual occasion is his metaphysical construct. It's another abstraction,
Mm-hmm.
but it's meant to apply at any scale, the quantum scale, the human scale, and everything in between, to account for the final real things of which the world is made up. And an actual
Fascinating.
occasion has a physical pole, which is inheriting the past, a mental pole, which is anticipating the future possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And every event in nature is doing that at some level of intensity.
Mm-hmm.
And as the evolutionary process ramps up, uh, Whitehead would say evolution presupposes the function of the actual occasion, which is to inherit the past, inject a little bit of novelty, and give that to the future to be inherited by the next round, by the
Mm-hmm.
next occasion of experience. And so you're both getting uh, a distillation of the basic structure of experience, a generalization of that to all events in nature, and it's kind of a generalization of evolutionary theory as well,
Right. Beautiful.
where in Darwin, the basic components that you need are inheritance, variation, and reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
The process of concrescence of an actual occasion, it has the physical pole inheriting the past. The mental pole is the variation, and it's a cyclical process. It's being reproduced over and over, and so you get the complexification, the arc of complexification as a result of this
Mm-hmm.
ontology. So that's the basic idea, and it's the key is shifting from this view that was dominant in physics and is still there in Einstein, where we think of um, mind just being sort of left, we're just this floating God's eye view observer. That's not going to work. We need to bring the observer back into nature, and we also need to think of uh, nature as a network of events, and think of space and time as adjuncts of events. In other words,
Yep.
space and time are our way of coordinating events, abstractly coordinating among events.
Mm.
Einstein's halfway there, that space and time is not a container that we're inside of. It's the relational
Yep.
field. Um, and so yeah, that's
Great.
Whitehead in a nutshell. I don't know if that helps or if you're more
Oh,
confused.
no, that's not at all. I was a couple of things. I'll just make some connections. So, a shorthand for what we're trying to do in UTOK, I'll sometimes give is sort of observing behavioral frequencies inside and out. Okay. So basically, in the first person, third person,
Hmm.
in coordination. But an even more sort of parallel connection. So when I was building this, I was concerned with consilience and E.O. Wilson's consilience. Um, and inside the academy, then you have the sciences and the humanities, and their riff and the two cultures, etc. And I was exploring various models for that. And when you were talking, it's been a while since I did this literature review, but I remember this. The book I'm 99% sure is called The Sciences and Humanities, and I think it's by Jones, like a 1967 book. Um, and he argued there was one concept that he could pull the thread on and yoke the sciences and the humanities together. It was experience.
Mm.
And so that whole book basically is it would be if you go to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance Quality, if that in that book, Persig or
Yeah.
whatever the story is to land on the concept of quality, which is essentially a science in humanities. Well, this guy landed on the concept of experience, and I wouldn't have been well placed if it was a Whiteheadian angle or even an allusion to Whitehead. I don't recall that. I wouldn't have necessarily assimilated that. But what you were
Mm.
saying there reminded me of how impressed I was of that book, and how the concept of experience was so multifaceted and rich that it pulled so many different perspectives and afforded coherence in doing so. So anyway, that's what I was feeling alive as you were describing it, and also reminding that parallel. So no, that was very helpful, at least to me, in terms of kind of getting I felt more resonant. The substance panpsychism stuff is a trouble for me to wrap my head around at times.
Mm. Mm.
The relational process elements, the pan experiential, I wanted to learn more. So I have my little note here. Ask Matt, so I can check
Yeah.
off. I got a better feel for it than I had previously. So I deeply appreciate that.
Right. I mean, a basic way to think about this is that the substance form of panpsychism is saying everything, say a particle has consciousness as one of its properties,
Yeah.
intrinsic property. Pan experientialism on this process ontological view, you wouldn't say an actual occasion has experience. It is experience. There's no underlying substrate that
Yep.
has experience as the property. It is experience. And that's, Whitehead has to really pull some pull on our grammar and twist it. And he has his own theory of propositions, but he's worried about the way that logic since Aristotle has been locked into this subject predicate structure, which
Okay.
leads right into a substance property ontology. And
Mm-hmm.
he says we've been hoodwinked by our own language into perceiving the world as though, the subject predicate grammar works great when what you're dealing with are gray stones.
Yep.
You have the stone and then it's got this inherent quality of grayness. Great. Got it. But most of the world isn't like that. And with quantum and relativity theory, the relational dimension of reality becomes front and center.
Totally.
But whether it's between observer and observed or any of the properties are relational. They're like uh, color. Red is not out there in the world, but nor is it in the brain.
Yep.
It's the relationship, right? Um, and so that relational way of thinking and the processual way of thinking is a difficult paradigm shift because it it the shift from point instance to events, for example, you have to let go of this Cartesian obsession with certainty and
Yep.
absolute precision. Like
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that vagueness is an ontological category.
Mm-hmm.
Part of reality has this character of vagueness. And that's just, if that's a fact of nature, well, our theory should reflect that,
Clearly.
you know? You
Yep.
and it's practically speaking, science has always known this, that measurement is you're never going to know exactly what the initial
Yep.
conditions are. You just can't do the measurements. Um, but that's not just in practice, that's actually in principle. And I think quantum physics bears that out.
That's
We've
true,
gotten
and I
as
agree.
precise as we can get,
Yep.
and there's still some fuzziness,
Definitely.
you know. So that's part of science letting go of the need for the precision of the abstract models we can come up with and the exactitude that we can get when we're talking about math. That's never going to map perfectly onto nature. right?
So,
Just because experience is vague. There's one moment it bleeds into the next, and we can get really precise enough to build all these wonderful machines and technologies. Uh, but we have to let go of that Cartesian dream or nightmare, maybe,
yep.
um, that
Yeah,
we could
no,
really nail it down to a
foundational
point instant.
certitude that then we're going to build perfect knowledge off of, right?
Right.
That foundationalist commitment is, I think, a big error. Definitely.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, so I double clicked on experience. Was there other things that maybe I threw you off a little bit, but if we want to come back and say, were there other things from the blog that you wanted to share or just have our audience consider in that, from your vantage point, the constructive angle on filling in the blind spot?
Um, well, I've kind of hinted at this, but one of the concerns I have with their um, basically transcendental orientation, which where it goes back to Kant, and whenever I find myself in dialogue with a physicalist, um, I always go to Kant as well because I think recognizing the epistemological preconditions of science helps us avoid the trap of some kind of reductive materialist view because it ends up undermining your own ability to even have the knowledge of
Mhm.
what you're calling matter in a scientific way. So, uh, but at the same time, I worry that we can get stuck in a kind of Kantian idealism and lose the sort of realism that I would prefer to be able to
Yeah.
defend. Um, and so, at times in the book they draw on Merleau-Ponty, and um, by the time of Merleau-Ponty's work, he's really pushed beyond even Husserl in terms of grounding experience in the body and in
Mhm.
embodiment and recognizing the way that the body is intertwined with the world. He talks about the flesh as we're most networked into the world. And so for Merleau-Ponty, it's embodied phenomenology, but the body is intimately related to its environment. And they quote Merleau-Ponty at one point saying that the bodily subject is a project of the world, a way the world locally self-organizes and self-individuates to constitute a living being. Um, and I think that's very resonant with what Whitehead says in Process and Reality,
Mm.
where he's talking about Kant and
Mhm.
describes Kant as basically saying that Kant's transcendental idealism is saying that the objective world is a construct that appears to the subject. And so Kant's question is, what is the nature of subjectivity such that an objective world that science can study in terms of physical laws and everything, and
Mhm.
such that our math applies to it? How is that possible? But it's a construct. It's an appearance for Kant. Science is about the phenomenal world. It doesn't tell us what reality is in itself. It's what our
Yep.
human perspective allows us to say about science, about nature.
Mhm.
Whitehead is saying rather than a merely objective world being constructed by a subject, Whitehead reverses that and says the subject emerges from the world
Right.
as a superject is his term,
Ah,
um,
really interesting.
which is a neat, yeah, with transjective, superjective.
Mhm.
Whitehead has the sense that another way of talking about the structure of experience is the physical pole that's inheriting the past. It's also receiving objective data, he would say. So experience begins with objectivity, actually. The already perished occasions of the past grow into this new moment of experience. And then there's what he calls the subjective form, where there's an interpretation of the past, and the mental pole begins to ingress novel possibilities about how to interpret it. But then once the satisfaction is achieved, that moment of experience completes itself, it perishes and becomes a superject, which
Yes.
from the perspective of the next occasion is an objective data to be
Right.
brought into the next round of concrescence.
Love
And
it.
so Whitehead is putting the subject really back into nature as
Right.
part of this process um, of experiencing, which is the inversion of Kant's picture. And
Mhm.
so I'm left wondering, is what the blind spot authors have done just sort of a Kantian holding pattern, as it were,
Mhm.
to defend against reductive materialism, but
Mhm.
we kind of got dropped off at this more or less idealistic
Yep.
perspective. And the reconstructive project then becomes, okay, how do we make this more realistic? How do we understand what science wants to call nature as not just an appearance to our mind,
Totally.
even if
Totally.
it's an embodied mind,
Right.
right?
Awesome.
So,
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Are you familiar with Roy Bhaskar? I don't
oh,
know.
sure, critical
Yeah,
realism, yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
So I find a lot of affinity to his critique of Kant and trying to move um, to a more realistic perspective. He's embedded in the social sciences more than psychology, so he is emphasizing the social construction of reality and then bridging that, the critical, with scientific realism, which he does through a stratified nature, very similar to what John and I end up arguing for in our layers. But I was seeing what John and I were doing more at the psychological, phenomenological level than what Roy Bhaskar was doing. So a critical realism variant, but more at the level of psychology. But I brought it in as you were talking about this from a Whiteheadian perspective. That's also situated at the level of the subject and the phenomenology, and so that drew me in to be more. Yeah, this is sort of the level that I'm concerned about more than the social construction reality. I'm concerned about the constructed phenomenological reality and how that
Mm.
emerges, and how to place all of them. That's for me the socially constructed intersubjective, the subject, which is a human, both it's got a propositional network and an embodied primate phenomenology, all of which are both emerging and constructing in all of our dynamic feedback loops. But
Yeah.
that's a super cool description of Whitehead. Again, helpful. I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing I can throw into the mix here is Whitehead's technical use of the term society, which would be it's a nexus or a group of actual occasions can come together to form a society. And actually, most of the enduring bodies in our world, our own bodies, plants, animals, tables, chairs, these are societies of actual occasions
Okay.
uh, that share. It's a grouping of actual occasions that share some definite characteristic that's been repeated
Mm,
uh, through the whole lineage, right? And so the form of the chair is a function of the actual occasions that compose it, reiterating or repeating the same form. And it's wood, right? And so wood lasts as long as it lasts until it rots. And so no form can be repeated indefinitely perfectly
mhm,
because of the way it's relating to its environment. And so Whitehead is able to say that like our bodies are a society of cells, and that's just an analogy anyone could make. But our bodies, in other words, are socially constructed, but not by human culture,
right.
by the
Right.
community of cells that's
By the community of
constantly
cells.
right.
Yes.
An atom is the social construction of protons and
Hmm.
electrons and neutrons,
Right.
right? And so he wants and he is explicitly choosing a category that we usually apply at the human domain. Humans have societies, and nature is not social. Whitehead's saying, well, we can generalize this category too. And so
Yep.
society goes all the way down. And what human societies are doing is a more sophisticated
Hmm.
version of what's going on at every scale in nature
Hmm.
as actual occasions come into these uh, resonant
Yeah.
relationships with each other.
Lovely.
Mhm.
So when you're looking at Whitehead, you said that there are these four categories, and I agree. These are the dominant four categories in analytic philosophy of mind:
Yeah.
materialism, physicalism, idealism, panpsychism, and dualism. They're
Hmm.
various. If you go to the Kuhn article, he throws monism in there, and he gives it quantum theories. But these are the big four,
Right,
and
right.
whether those are differentiated, he leaves a category for integrated information theory. Would you? But the way you're describing it, I mean, do you place then the Whiteheadian view in a panpsychism category, or
I think that's where it fits best. I don't think he's
okay,
an idealist. He's very explicitly, I mean, he's in deep dialogue with German idealism and British idealism, but he's very clear that he's looking for a realism here. And so, I have other friends and interlocutors who don't want me to refer to Whitehead as a panpsychist. My friend Tim Jackson, for example. Uh, but I don't, I think he's a species of panpsychist. Yeah.
okay,
But of course, how we categorize these things, I don't think that these are the four, and I can't be talked out of thinking of it this way. Because,
right,
like, yeah, monism, pluralism, you could have a materialist monism or an idealist monism. You could have an idealist pluralism. You could have materialist pluralism. I mean, so there's different ways of slicing it up, which is very interesting. But I don't want to get, this is just a simple schematic way of thinking about
yeah,
the
fair
options.
enough. Well, right.
Um,
It came to my head because I'm actually writing. I'm basically
mm,
trying to justify extended naturalism as not falling well into any. These are the four dominant categories, and I want us to position, John and I are positioning this as a new category. It's closest, perhaps, to an emergent natural physicalism, but it doesn't fit well for, and we want to reject that label for a whole host of different reasons.
fair enough.
Um,
Nobody wants to be labeled.
so so anyway, that I was just curious, and so anyway, the that was a question that was salient to me because I was deciding
Yeah.
whether or not we are going to jam our extended naturalism in a category or not, and we're going with no. Actually, I want. I really think these categories are dated. I think they're a function of the split of matter
Yeah.
mind, and if we're going to transcend the Enlightenment gap, we need new formulations, much like. Well, in
Eh,
Whitehead's case, not so new, but
mhm.
new ways of thinking about the grammar for sure.
And you might be right about that. I mean, I have days where I think I should just give up this panpsych. Like the battle has been lost. Panpsychism is a certain has a certain definition now because of the rise of analytic philosophers of mind who want to defend a panpsychist, a substance property form of panpsychism. So maybe I should just let it go. But I don't know. We'll
Yeah,
see. I'm not overly attached to it.
yeah. No, I
Um,
think it's. I mean, it's a
and I
category
like,
that helps, and then orient and then clarify. So the pragmatic
sure.
usefulness.
Right. Right. Yeah. Um, I know we got to wrap up here.
Yeah.
Uh, Evan Thompson did have a chance to chime in and respond to my review, and so folks can see we've had a little bit of a back and forth there. Um, and one of the issues that we ended up talking about in terms of the relationship between model and experience, right? Uh, what kind of got the whole scientific revolution kicked off was this Copernican revolution, where the old Ptolemaic geocentric model was replaced by the heliocentric model.
Sure.
And in their book, they tell this history, um, and without much in the way of unpacking or nuance, just say basically now we know what is really true, which is that the sun is at the center and the earth goes around the sun. And on the one hand, I think it's clear that in terms of more context and a better approximation, the Copernican, the heliocentric is better than the Ptolemaic. But on the other hand, Copernicus's model was actually way less accurate than Ptolemy's model in terms of making predictions about when the eclipse is going to happen or where the planets are going to be. It wasn't until Kepler added the ellipses
Yep.
and Newton improved the math that it actually became as predictive as Ptolemy's model. But in terms of telling us where the planets are going to be in the sky, either model works. If you want to land a rover on Mars, you better stick with the heliocentric, Newtonian model, because otherwise you're never going to find Mars with Ptolemy's model, obviously. But it seems to me that if we want to avoid the blind spot and if we want to not be um, hoodwinked by our models, we can't say that it is really the case that the heliocentric model is true in an unambiguous sense because
Right.
the sun is moving. Everything's moving around everything else. And
Totally.
so in order to say the heliocentric model is really the case, we're still imagining ourselves out there and floating in space with some disembodied God's eye view looking down. And we would have to be I mean, physicists know this, but
Right.
the way we usually think about it, we would have to be in the same inertial reference frame as the sun to see the sun as if it were still and the other planets moving around it. And there's a lot of qualifications required to say that this heliocentric view is the correct view. It's correct from a certain perspective.
Amen.
The Ptolemaic view is correct from another perspective. What's
Right.
the true perspective? I think that's a very difficult question to answer. And in order to avoid the blind spot, I would have liked the authors to be a little bit more cautious about this very typical story of scientific triumphalism, where it's like we now know,
Mm-hmm.
well, we've improved the approximation, but what is the true movement of the Earth and the Sun relative to each other? Well, I think it's very complicated actually to try to picture that.
Right. Actually, I just saw on Twitter somebody had sort of given a cross time trajectory of sun, and it is. It's
Through
a
the
massive
galaxy.
through the galaxy, right?
Right.
And
So
that's then
even in
one
that
frame of
view,
reference,
that's
right?
better.
You know,
Right.
but
Exactly. But that's
still,
another frame of
it's still a
reference.
frame of
Yeah.
reference of our galaxy in relation around this particular structure that then could be looked at from another aspectualizing
Right. What would that
angle.
movement look like from the perspective outside the Milky Way, though?
That's
Then
right.
it's like, so yeah. So that's just a question I raised, and I'm curious to see. I don't know if Evan will follow up, but I think it really brings uh it puts a fine, well, what's the right expression here? It's a key leverage point to really
Hmm.
test out the critique of the blind spot and what it opens up for us. If we can hold more lightly this view of the history of science as um, a triumphal march toward the true view, as if we've somehow arrived now.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't mean to downplay the extent to which science advances, but if you look at paradigm shifts and how things get totally reconfigured, there's a gestalt shift in what we even thought we were perceiving. It's not just new
Yeah.
ideas applying to the perceptual field; it's the perceptual field shifts, and so we could have a future physics could be just as dramatically transformative as the Copernican model was in replacing the Ptolemaic model, right? And so
Yep.
we should be cautious about thinking we now know, you know,
Totally.
what's really the case.
Yep.
We're still talking about a model either way. So
Right. And I'm sensing, and maybe this is, egocentric, optimistic, whatever. I'm sensing a kind of philosophical paradigm shift potentially on the cusp, and that there is an opportunity. There clearly is an enlightenment gap that we call, the mind-body enlightenment gap at some level. What would it look like if that were closed? And I think the stuff you're doing points exactly in that direction. I think it's beautiful and super cool.
yeah, it's a team effort.
So, all right.
But
Well,
I think it's going to be weirder than people think, when we come out the other side of this, because bringing subject and object back together again and putting consciousness back in nature, it changes what we have imagined consciousness to be, but it also changes what we have imagined nature to be. And so it's an exciting time. Yeah.
amen to that. Well, thanks for coming and joining and sharing your thoughts on the blind spot, the
Oh,
world, consciousness, and everything else. It was really, really enjoyable and edifying for me, and I deeply appreciate, like I said, the work you're doing.
yeah, likewise. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation, Greg. This was a lot of fun.
So, appreciate it.
Cool.